Listen, Bill, nobody killed anybody. Someone died. It happens all the time.
And on March 7th, 1999, less than a week after screening what would be his last film, Eyes Wide Shut, legendary director Stanley Kubrick was found dead. The timing of it all still raises questions. Only days earlier, he called it the best film he'd ever made. Days later, he was gone. Eyes Wide Shut wasn't just entertainment, it was evidence. 400 relentless days, filming a movie that exposed a world few dared to depict on camera. Was Eyes Wide Shut the making of a film, or something more? An intent to send us all a message? At its surface, Eyes Wide Shut follows Dr. Bill Harford, a successful New York physician played by Tom Cruise, whose seemingly perfect life begins to fracture after a single confession. When his wife, Alice, played by his real-life partner Nicole Kidman, admits to having once fantasized about another man, Bill is shaken. His composure, ego, and sense of moral certainty collapse. In a haze of jealousy and wounded pride, he drifts through a nocturnal New York that feels more like a dream than a city, wandering aimlessly, searching for distraction, but finding only temptation. That's when chance, or fate, intervenes. At a dimly lit jazz bar, Bill runs into an old friend, Nick Nightingale, a pianist he knew from medical school. Nick mentions he's been playing at private parties, the kind where guests arrive masked, and the only word that gets you in is a password, Fidelio. Curiosity replaces caution. Bill can't resist. He rents a cloak and mask from a costume shop in the village, a strange transaction that already feels like an initiation. Even the shopkeeper's daughter and her shadowy visitors seem to echo the moral decay waiting at the end of his night. Later, under the glow of streetlights and the hum of the city, Bill takes a cab to the outskirts of Long Island. The driver says nothing. The road is silent, the world narrowing as he approaches a massive gated estate. At the gate, he gives the password, Fidelio, and is waved through. Inside, the film shifts tone completely. Choral chants echo through marble halls. Robed figures move in ritual formation. Masks conceal faces, identities, and morality. What begins as a jealous husband's descent into temptation becomes something far darker, a revelation about hierarchy, ritual, and the price of curiosity. When Bill trespasses into that secret world, he isn't just walking into an elite gathering. He's walking into Victor Ziegler's world, the same charming, well-connected patient who earlier threw lavish parties and spoke in riddles. Ziegler represents the polished face of the city's elite, but behind that civility lies access to rooms, rituals, and circles most people never see. By the time Bill realizes whose world he stepped into, it's too late. The mask is no longer a disguise. It's an invitation and a warning. For Kubrick, time became the one thing he couldn't control. Every frame he shot carried a sense of countdown. Each take, each setup, each sleepless night, part of a personal race he couldn't afford to lose. A typical Hollywood production lasts around 60 days. Eyes Wide Shut stretched past 400, one of the longest continuous shoots in cinema history. What others saw as overkill, Kubrick treated as necessity. He rebuilt entire New York City blocks inside Pinewood Studios in the UK, meticulous down to the last street sign, determined to recreate Manhattan under total control. That obsessive reconstruction came at a cost, physical, mental, and financial. By the end, the urgency was visible on every face around him. Cast, crew, assistants, all caught in the gravity of one man's last, consuming vision, all of this because Kubrick wasn't simply filming, he was documenting. But documentation comes with danger, especially when the subject is power itself. Eyes Wide Shut's famously long shoot had already tested endurance beyond reason, but by the end, the toll on Kubrick was plain. The people closest to him saw a man running on will alone. Each scene became a measure of stamina rather than time. That exhaustion was mirrored in the cast. Tom Cruise later described repeating basic actions hundreds of times, most memorably, walking through a doorway again and again until Kubrick found the exact rhythm he wanted. The repetition wasn't indulgence, it was about stripping away performance until only ritual remained. The process blurred acting and endurance, transforming the role into an exercise in submission to precision. For Kubrick, that submission replicated the very systems the film sought to expose: perfection as control, routine as obedience, image as truth. By the time the cameras finally stopped, the production had outgrown its purpose as art. It had become proof of survival, a defense mechanism captured in real time. And when it ended, the question that lingered wasn't just whether the film was finished, it was whether Kubrick himself ever had a chance to outlast the system he dared to document, and whether that system noticed what he was doing before the cameras stopped rolling. Eyes Wide Shut's most secretive scenes weren't imagined in a vacuum. They were rooted in research that reached into real-world power. During development, Kubrick studied ritualistic societies, keeping a copy of the book Cult and Occult at his home and examining documented accounts of secret orders operating in New York. Film historian Michael Herr, in his memoir Kubrick, recalled Stanley requesting documentation on Freemasonry and Skull and Bones to understand how ritual and architecture shape hierarchy. He wasn't inventing a conspiracy aesthetic, he was mapping existing symbols and their intersections with art, power, and control. Each element in the film reflected that map. The character Victor Ziegler, for instance, carried layers of coded meaning. His name translates from German as brickmaker, an echo of the Freemason tradition of builders and masons. He's wealthy, titled, and operates behind polished civility, traits aligned with the discrete networks Kubrick believed shaped high society. That was no accident. The mansion used for the masked ceremony was Mentmore Towers, a manor once tied to one of Europe's most influential banking families. Now, think about that. That setting turned the film's central ritual from symbolic fiction into a provocation. Kubrick placed his lens inside an estate physically tied to the family most frequently whispered about in stories of secret wealth and control. By the time Eyes Wide Shut reached completion, the film had grown beyond narrative. It became a coded reference system, an atlas of concealed power, disguised as erotic mystery. What happened once that atlas was finally screened would confirm just how unsettling it truly was. When Kubrick's final version was shown behind closed doors, the reactions revealed just how divided that room was. He screened the film for Warner Brothers executives and his inner circle, including Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman. Kubrick told his wife Christiane afterward that it was the best work of his life. Some praised its precision, others called it maddeningly obscure, but everyone understood it was unlike anything Hollywood had ever seen. 6 days later, Kubrick was gone. Between his death in March and the July 16th theatrical release, Warner Brothers made alterations, most obviously in the mansion sequence. In the US theatrical cut, after his death, Warner Brothers inserted CGI to secure an R rating, adding computer-generated figures into the ritual scene to obscure explicit imagery instead of the more restrictive NC-17. These edits were presented as practical, but for many viewers they altered the emotional logic of the sequence itself. Behind the digital silhouettes, something essential was blurred, both literally and thematically. The line that remains untouched, though, underscores the film's warning. Toward the end, Bill Harford is summoned to Ziegler's mansion, the same setting where the story began. Ziegler, no longer the gracious host, waits for Bill alone in his billiard room. Between them lies a red pool table, glowing under a single lamp, the felt color echoing both blood and temptation. Ziegler paces slowly, a drink in hand, his tone calm but razor-edged. He tells Bill he knows about the ritual, knows he was there, and knows the woman who sacrificed herself for him. What follows is one of the most unnerving exchanges in Kubrick's filmography, a conversation that pretends to reassure, but instead reasserts control. If I told you their names, you wouldn't sleep so well. It lands as Kubrick's last unsilenced truth, a glimpse into a power structure that depends on silence to function. That silence mattered, because what Kubrick exposed in fiction echoed what, years later, would surface in plain sight. In hindsight, the world Kubrick framed looks less like allegory and more like a preview of what would come. Eyes Wide Shut quietly outlined the same hierarchies and habits that later surfaced in the mainstream around Jeffrey Epstein, a man of wealth, access, and secrecy, using all three to protect himself. The film's mass gatherings weren't designed as fantasy, they were studies in how status cloaks criminality. The connection isn't coincidence. In the 2019 biography Kubrick, An Odyssey, Jeffrey Epstein was described as the living embodiment of Victor Ziegler. A Kubrick biographer, not a conspiracy theorist, not a Reddit thread, drew that line directly. Ziegler, charming, connected, above consequence. He hosts orgies, comforts the cover-up, and speaks in code about what must not be named. The line he delivers to Bill isn't so much a threat as it is a confession. The same dynamic defined Epstein's world. Insiders knew, outsiders looked away, and victims were told their silence was safety. Kubrick's film captures that machinery of power through ritual and compliance. He shows the servants who disappear, the women treated as currency, and the men who treat exposure as inconvenience. In Epstein's case, the 2019 indictment and unsealed depositions from civil cases map the same structure in real life. Private jets, selective guest lists, and coded invitations masking a criminal network. Whether coincidence or design, the parallels are impossible to ignore. What do you see, coincidence or pattern? Instead of inventing conspiracies, Kubrick built his narrative from meticulous research. He spent years cross-referencing writings on secret societies, sex magic orders, and sociological texts about ritualized exploitation. He commissioned mock intelligence-style reports for character studies, not to shock, but to understand how hierarchy sustains itself. What emerged was a portrait of power as performance. The costumes may change, but the rules remain. When the Epstein story broke years later, the resemblance was undeniable. The opulence, the denial, the polite indifference. Eyes Wide Shut wasn't prophecy. It was documentation of behaviors that already existed, just hidden behind the right invitations. Kubrick's insight came at a cost. By the time the Epstein story broke in 2019, the man most prepared to explain what he'd documented was already gone. And in his absence, the film's most dangerous revelations would be reframed, dismissed, and buried under the label Hollywood feared most: conspiracy theory. Kubrick's absence left a vacuum no studio could fill. According to producer Jan Harlan and Christian Kubrick in later interviews, Stanley had outlined press talking points and written notes explaining how Eyes Wide Shut examined power, secrecy, and desire. After his death, those prepared materials were never released to journalists covering the film. The studio took control of the message. What was intended to be a study of elite corruption was quickly reshaped into a glossy erotic mystery that could sell tickets. Ironically, Kubrick himself had cut the film's first teaser trailer months earlier, pairing its opulent visuals with Chris Isaac's "Baby Did a Bad, Bad Thing." The film's marketing promised seduction rather than revelation. By the time Warner Brothers launched their campaign, they leaned fully into that implication. Posters featured Cruise and Kidman locked in reflection, their faces framed as a couple on the edge. The result was confusion. Audiences expected erotica, but walked into ritual, silence, and coded dread. What should have sparked questions about its symbols and references instead became a referendum on the movie's pacing. Journalists framed the 400-day production as indulgence, evidence of Kubrick's fading touch rather than his escalating purpose. Each layer of misrepresentation diluted Kubrick's intent. Without his voice, the film's investigation into secrecy was reduced to a misunderstood marital drama. His perfectionism was described as mania. His obsession with meaning was treated as arrogance. The narrative shifted entirely, from what Eyes Wide Shut revealed to whether it was any good. Christian Kubrick later said her husband believed this was the first time he had integrated everything he'd learned about marriage, power, and human behavior into a single film, and that he knew it was his best. His death silenced the only witness who could interpret its structure, the one person able to explain how its rigorous creation reflected the cost of revealing dangerous truths. That silence would soon make sense once the circumstances of those final months came into focus. The 400 days that pushed Kubrick's body to its breaking point. and the 5 days between his final screening and his death that no one could explain. Kubrick's death on March 7th, 1999, just 5 days after screening the film for Warner Brothers executives, left questions unanswered. Without his voice, the film's intent became subject to interpretation rather than explanation. The studio moved forward with the release, including the digital alterations to the orgy scene that Kubrick had reportedly resisted. The prepared press materials he'd written were never distributed. The talking points he'd outlined went unused. The official cause, heart attack, answered how he died. It didn't answer what happened in those 5 days between the screening and his death. The timing raised questions that were never publicly addressed, leaving only the film itself as testimony to what he believed he'd captured. If the film truly depicted the power structures Kubrick believed existed, his silence removed the only voice that could defend its intent. In the film, Ziegler puts it best when dismissing Bill's suspicions. Listen, nobody killed anybody. Someone died. It happens all the time. Life goes on. It always does, until it doesn't. That line wasn't just dialogue. It was instruction. Watch again, with that tone in mind. The film warned us how denial sounds when power is speaking. The silence that followed proved the lesson still applies. Kubrick's film survived. He didn't. 400 days to finish his truth, 5 days to lose his life.